Om Asato Ma Satkamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Mayeti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Our subject today is how to be happy. Everyone wants to be happy, no one wants to suffer. And that's universal. No sane person would ever say that I want to be miserable. And because this is what all people want, the Sanskrit term for this is called Purushartha. Purusha is people or human beings. Artha means what they want. So, if we have to say one thing that we all want universally, with no exceptions, and I'm obviously speaking of people in their right senses, they all want to be happy and they don't want pain and misery. Where we do differ is not in what we want, but how we will get it. So we have different ideas about what it is that will make me happy and what it is that will take away my pain and suffering. Now, all of these ideas that we have about what will bring us happiness can broadly be categorized into 4 groups. One is clearly the idea of wealth. Wealth becomes a value in life because of this strong conviction that wealth will bring me happiness. And that makes sense because whatever I need, I'm able to get with the power of money in my hand. And whatever it is that brings me pain or suffering, I'm able to somehow escape that as much as I can if I have sufficient financial resources at my disposal. And therefore, wealth becomes a value in itself because it helps me achieve happiness. Now, there's another idea also that it's not just wealth that can bring me happiness, but because clearly, well, just the idea that I have a lot of wealth can bring some amount of happiness, granted. But we know that wealth is useful only when it is used. While having a lot of money in your bank deposit or in your investments can bring some amount of the happiness that comes from security, but a more happiness can come if I actually utilize that wealth to get me the things that I want, things that will make me happy, good food, or whatever other interests I have in life. And therefore, enjoyment that can come through using of this wealth properly, that also becomes a value in life. And all enjoyment that comes to us comes through our senses. The beautiful sights that we see through the eyes, the great sounds that we hear through the ears, and so on. So just like wealth, therefore, sensual enjoyment that comes through our senses also becomes a value in life. Then there is other idea that it's not just wealth and sensual pleasures that can bring me happiness, but living an honest, truthful life, living an ethical life. According to some, the joy that we get from living a truly honest and ethical life, even if we do not have sufficient wealth or sufficient sensual pleasures, just the joy of being honest and truthful can beat the other avenues of happiness. And therefore, an ethical life, an honest life, a life of dharma, as they say, that also becomes a value in life. And then, of course, there are others who say that happiness can come through seeking God, through having a spiritual ideal. While we may have several other goals in life, that if there is no place for a spiritual goal in our life, a spiritual ideal in our life, then happiness will not be complete. And so there are these four broad categories, therefore: wealth, sensual enjoyment, ethical life, and spiritual life, as being four broad categories through which happiness can come. Now, the Sanskrit term for these four, wealth is called artha, sensual enjoyment is called kama, ethical life is called dharma, and moksha, that pursuit of spiritual freedom, that is what spiritual life stands for. Now, because these are instruments that will bring me happiness, these instruments also by extension are called purusharthas, or the sometimes in some books and some discourses, they refer to purusharthas as goals of human life, as if to say, the scriptures say these are the four goals. Actually, that's not what it means. Artha means what we want. Purusha is people. So what people want. Now, very few people, well, sometimes it does happen that we recognize in the beginning that, say, wealth is a means to some end. But sometimes we may forget, and then wealth can become an end in itself. So that danger exists. But by and large, we recognize that these are means that will bring me happiness. And so therefore, these means towards happiness, by extension, also becomes the things that we want. And therefore, it is customary to say these are the four primary things that people want. According to Vedanta, both wealth and sensual enjoyment can bring us happiness. Well, we don't need Vedanta for that. We can know it from our own life's experience, that these things do bring us happiness in life. But we also know, when we have lived long enough, that the happiness that comes from these things is very short-lived. If my happiness is solely dependent on the wealth that I have, well, as long as I have that money in my hand, I can be happy. When that disappears or becomes less, correspondingly, my happiness also will become less. Same is true with sensual enjoyment as well. Ice cream, if you enjoy eating ice cream, as long as the ice cream is in front of you, there is some happiness. When you start eating it, there's more happiness. While it's still there on your tongue, there's a greater happiness. When it passes your tongue and goes here, then there is not much happiness. After that, it's just a lot of work to just digest all that we have eaten. And once that ice cream in front of you is finished, and there is no more stock in your refrigerator, then only the memory remains, and perhaps a regret. Oh, I could have had some more. So all happiness that we get from material entities is short-lived, and oftentimes it can come with a touch of regret in the end. That, oh, I wanted some more, but I didn't have enough. And also, we know it's the nature of the body being a part of this material world, will follow the laws of matter. But we see in life that those who live an extremely indulgent life, indulging a lot in these material pursuits, they experience greater physical and mental weakness. So therefore, a disciplined life is often a life of restraint is often advised by all elders and by all books, because the more restraint we have, the longer will we have the ability, physically and mentally, to work efficiently and to even experience happiness in life. Now, the happiness that comes from ethical life is certainly more lasting. It lasts longer than simply the happiness that comes from wealth and sensual enjoyment. But even the happiness through ethical life cannot bring us total fulfillment, because there are certain realities of our present existence that cannot be solved merely through ethics. The reality of death, for instance. So the questions that transcend death, the questions about what happens after death, the questions about what was there before birth, we might try to find some scientific answers to it, but it's never completely fulfilling. There's always that mystery. And that mystery cannot be solved only through ethical life. And so we have to recognize that while ethics is a very important and indispensable requirement in religious life, ethics itself should not be confused with religion, because sometimes we hear people say, what is it about religion? Just be good and do good. Well, not quite. It's possible. For instance, there are a lot of people who don't believe in God, don't believe in religion, who are atheists and agnostics. They are good people, and they do a lot of good, but they don't consider themselves religious. So religion is, surely, it's not that religion does mean being good and doing good, but religion goes to the root of the matter and said, what does being good really mean? Why should I do good? If my existence is just between this birth and death, and after death everything ends, why should I be good at all? Even the basis for ethics, basis for a moral life, cannot be answered, cannot be understood purely from an ethical standpoint. Besides, just probably a utilitarian standard. Oh, if we are all good, then we all can live peacefully without killing each other and be happy. That's understandable. But beyond that, it doesn't really answer the kind of questions that can come in our heart about life itself. In the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, of course, we know this phrase occurs: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness being among the inalienable rights of all human beings. Now, all of these three, life, liberty, and happiness, in the truest sense of the term, can come to us through leading a spiritual life. So how do we pursue happiness in a spiritual way? There is a way to pursue happiness in many different ways, as we have seen. But if we see ourselves as spiritual seekers and we want to be happy, what shall we do as spiritual seekers? Now, seeking happiness itself, there is nothing bad about it. There is nothing material about it. Even spiritual people want to be happy. Why else would they seek God? So seeking happiness is not in itself a bad ideal. The question is, how do we go about it? And as spiritual seekers, is there a spiritual way of trying to achieve happiness? In that best-selling book of Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, it's written so long ago, and still it has a lot to teach all of us. I'm sure many of us have heard about the book, and many of us probably have read it as well. It's an extremely great book, and I'm sure many of us probably read it long back. Among the very useful insights that the author shares, two sentences that really I was very impressed by when I was young, when I was a student and read this book, was this. He writes towards the end of the book, "The principles taught in this book will work only when they come from the heart. I'm not advocating a bag of tricks. I'm talking about a new way of life." And this is all the more true about when we speak about practicing spiritual life. Because spiritual life is not just about, oh, just tell us what we should do and then we'll just do it. No, it's not about, so because we use the word technique. What is the technique to do it? It's not about just about technique, just applying something mechanically and trying to see if it works. It will really work. It can work in a superficial way if you just kind of just try to employ these principles in a mechanical way. But this will truly work and with a lasting effect only if it truly comes from the heart, if it truly is becomes a life-transforming practice. And that's why a superficial practice of spiritual life will bring only superficial benefits. If we want deep, long-lasting benefits from spiritual life, then it can't be simply a superficial practice. It has to come from the heart. It has to somehow, as Swami Vivekananda used to say, it should tingle into every drop of blood and flow through all the veins. In other words, it must inform not just our actions, but also the way we think, the way we do our work, the way we relate with other people. And so, here are a few things that we can do as spiritual seekers of pursuing happiness spiritually. First thing is to make an effort to live without expectations in life. If we look in our heart, we see that our lives are filled with expectations of many different kinds. At the very least, I hope it's a sunny day today. But again, that's an expectation. And what day it is going to be, the day will decide. My expectation is not going to change the outcome. And yet, we cannot stop ourselves from expecting. There is a text called the Bhagavata, which has this Sanskrit advice in Sanskrit. It says, Ashahi paramam dukkham, nairashyam paramam sukham, which simply means living with expectation produces profound misery. Living without expectation produces profound happiness. And this living without expectation, it becomes easier if we are convinced that what is due to us, what is due to us, that is what we truly deserve in life, what is our due, will come to us no matter what. That if we believe that there is, in an overall scheme of things, there is such a thing as justice. And last week I spoke at Harvard, and we had quite a bit of discussion about karma and about justice. And in that I mentioned that life might seem unjust if we just limit our view of life to only this one lifetime. Clearly, if my life begins at birth and ends at death, then not everything is going to make sense. Some things are going to appear profoundly unfair and unjust, and that's the experience of many people. But when we are speaking about spiritual life, the life of spirit is not limited only to the life of this body, which just occupies one lifetime. Just like there is this long-running serial, say, TV serial, and If you have been watching it right from the beginning all through, then things kind of make sense because you know how the story is developing. But let's say this TV serial has been going on for a while, and one of your friends says, "Hey, have you seen that?" And you say, "No, I haven't seen it. Why don't you take a look?" And then by which time, some 3 seasons and 5 episodes are already over, and you don't have time to kind of binge watch all from the beginning. So then you just take some episode and say, "Okay, let me take a look." Now, not everything is going to make sense if you just pick up a random episode in the middle, because things aren't like, why is this happening this way? Why is this person looks good, and why is this person suffering? But you have no idea what happened in the earlier episodes. I have no idea what's going to happen in later episodes. If I limit my judgment only to this one random episode in the middle, things are not going to make sense. That's pretty much the situation now. We are trying to judge life with just looking this one episode of our one lifetime. And so that's why I said, in the larger scheme of things, now we might say, well, what do I know? I don't remember my past births. I don't know what future births will I have. So how can I be sure? Absolutely, I completely understand that we don't remember it. But that's where the Shraddha comes in. So if you believe in the heart of your hearts, again, there is no proof, there is no evidence, but if you believe that there is such a thing as justice in the overall scheme of things, then you know that expectation is totally useless. That what will come to me will come to me. Nobody can stop it. And if something is not going to come to me, it will never come to me, even if I move heaven and earth. And so, living without expectation. Now, first of all, is it possible? And this I can tell you, it's absolutely possible. If it were impossible, it would the books, the scriptures would never ask us to do it. So whatever we are told by these wisdom of the great ones of the past, they could do it, and none of them said that only they can do it and the rest of us just worship them. They said, we could do it and you can do it too. So living without expectation is possible. And of course we know what will be, will be. There is that a favorite verse of mine from the Panchadashi. It says, Yad abhavi natad bhavi, bhavi chet natad anyatha, iti chinta vishagnoyam bodho brahma nivartakaha. Which simply means this. In Sanskrit it sounds very musical, but it simply means this. What is going to happen will happen. What will not happen will not happen. Knowing this, wise ones become free from the poison of anxiety and free from all delusion. Anxiety is compared to a poison. We know if you take a huge lot of poison, then we'll immediately drop dead. But if we take a little bit of poison, it will kind of work its way all through and paralyze us. It'll completely shatter our life. Anxiety is like that. Anxiety is like a small dose of poison entering, and it saps away all our energy, all our hope. And the best way to remove anxiety is to recognize that what is going to be, it's going to be. And what will not be, will not be. Now that doesn't mean I just sit in a corner doing nothing. What it means is I need to do what I need to do. I must carry out all my duties and responsibilities as best I can. And after having done my best, I must have that enough detachment to step back and said, I have done my best. Now what will happen will happen. What will not happen will not happen. A person who can do this, such a person can be truly happy. So living without expectation becomes possible if we recognize we all do our duty and let things work the way they should. Swami Vivekananda used to say, our job is to put the chemicals together. Crystallization will take place on its own. And that's exactly what this first practice could be. living without expectation. And what we can do, all of us, we can just look in our heart and say, well, clearly, at present, I have a lot of expectations in life. What do I do with these? Let's say, if I expect to do well in my exams, by simply expecting it and then being anxious about it is just not going to do anything. Well, if I want to do well in my exams, I need to study hard, I need to work hard. If I concentrate my attention there, then what will happen will happen. But merely being anxious about the results, being anxious about the exams will not help. So that's the kind of attitude a spiritual seeker will have. The next thing, so living without expectation. The second thing is living without regrets. Again, all of us, when we are very young, we probably may not have too many regrets. But as we grow older, we keep on collecting more and more regrets in life. And if you're not careful, our life could just become just a bag of regrets. And that takes away all joy from life. If you just being regretting everything that happened. So as the Buddha said, yesterday is gone, never to come back. Tomorrow is not yet here. We must focus on today. And all regrets is about what has happened in the past. And so the more we cling to the past, the more anxious we are about the future, we are going to miss the present. So we are just kind of breathing and moving about mechanically like zombies, but we are not really living. If you want to live, then we cannot live in the past. If you want to live, we cannot live in the future. We can only live today. Every breath we take is a breath taken in the present moment. Tomorrow's breaths I cannot take today. Yesterday's breaths have already been taken. And so regrets is about our past holding us back. And it's not always about regrets. It could be also some wonderful memories. So it's the memories of the past, even some pleasant memories of the past. And it's fine. Sometimes we make excursions in our mind, thinking about the good old days and the good old time, which is fine. But if all of my energy and time is spent in thinking about the good old times, then I'm probably going to miss the present times. I'm not really living then. And so we need to find a way to get beyond the regrets that we have in life. And that happens when we recognize that everything that has happened in my life was necessary for my growth, for my education, for my maturity. And nothing in life is really useless. If we are convinced that if anything in life or any person or just anything, if anything is completely useless of no good reason for it to exist, it wouldn't exist. So the very fact that the thing is there shows that it is playing some role. And I oftentimes may not even know what role that thing is playing. But it has something to contribute in some way to the world as it is. And when the purpose of a thing is over, that thing is gone. We must still be concerned about some of the species that are getting extinct. But it's also possible to look at it this way. We have to take care. We don't have to mercilessly go on eliminating things in nature. But also, probably, the age of dinosaurs is gone. I don't think they had anything more to contribute. Just think about dinosaurs moving along Storrow Drive as we go. It can be still become a good subject for a sci-fi movie or thing, but kind of a fantasy movie. But to recognize that everything that has or is has some role to play. And similarly, everything that had happened in our lives, both good and bad, pleasant and unpleasant, had some role to play. Whatever I am today is a resultant of everything that happened in my past. So regrets are always about, oh, I wish I had done this thing differently. I wish that had not happened. We make the mistake of thinking that if we had an ability to kind of go back into our past and change some of the things or do things differently, maybe my present situation might be better if I could go and change a few things from my past. And I think that's a wrong way to think, because we are never sure. It's as they say now, well, nowadays they're doing, what is they calling like DNA editing or something? It's called DNA editing, right?
CRISPR.
Huh?
CRISPR.
Crisping. Yeah, but say a little loudly.
CRISPR. CRISPR.
P-R-I?
CRISPR.
CRISPR. CRISPR, what does it mean? You're editing your DNA sequence or something. Yeah. So now suppose we have found out something, a troublesome problematic part in that. And so we say, okay, I'm going to snip it and then make it better. And perhaps it may be better, we don't know. But we also have to recognize that if I make one change here, what are the long-term effects, overall effects to the entire organism, we don't know. And so similarly, if I can go into my past and change one thing, let's say some problematic thing from my past, if I change it, and I'm going to think, well, if all the problems from my past are gone, then this present will be like even better than it is now. Maybe not. We don't know. We don't know how the resulting. It's like there's one thing, I think it's called the butterfly effect, that when a butterfly flutters in one place, we don't know, it could be very subtle, but things are being changed. The overall dynamic equilibrium that exists in the universe is being affected. Now, I mention all this to show that it's not as simple as just regretting some of the things that happened and just kind of trying to eliminate them. It doesn't work that way. Perhaps if some of those problematic things from my past were removed or snipped off, I might be in a worse situation today. I don't know. Swami Vivekananda says that it's oftentimes the difficult times in life, the times which are the troubled times in life that make us stronger, that bring out the inner strength, that make us more mature. Now, when we are going through those difficult times, it's never fun. It's extremely painful. But in retrospect, when we look back, that we became stronger as a result of those challenges that we have faced in our life. And if we just go back and eliminate all those challenges, we probably today might be still become weaker than we are. And so I mention all this to show that regrets don't help in any way. Living with regrets is like a life in hell, because it drains us of our energy, takes away all our hope, and is a big obstacle to be truly happy. So that's the second thing that we could do, living without expectation and making an effort to live without regrets. The third thing is living with a positive frame of mind. People have seen this, who have made conscious effort to live positively. I found that it improves their health at every level, physical, mental, spiritual. In fact, probably in the 60s or 70s, Norman Vincent Peale, he made a big fortune out of this, but it's a very wonderful way of emphasizing the power of positive thinking. If any new challenge that comes in our life, And if our first reaction is, oh my God, I can't do it, then the chances are I won't be able to do it. But if everything new comes, no matter how difficult, no matter a part of you says, oh, it's tough, but if you have that faith within you and say, and that's why I like that slogan, Obama, yes, I can. It's not just for political campaigning. I think it's even for our own individual lives. No matter what, because every challenge that comes in our life, no one is going to come and ask you, shall I bring this challenge to you? No, it's just going to come. We really don't have any option about the challenges we are going to facing now and the challenges we are going to face in the future. So since we don't have any option, the only option we have is whether I look on those challenges with a positive frame or a negative frame of mind. And therefore, this anything that comes, yes, I can. And sure, while trying to do it, there will be difficulties, there will be challenges, but the attitude of the mind, the idea that yes, I can conquer it, that releases some reserves within our system, and we are able to do things which will even surprise us. And therefore, this positive frame of mind is very important. And this comes through cultivating Shraddha, that deep faith in oneself. Swami Vivekananda once famously said, if you don't have any faith in yourself, your faith in God is useless. So it's not enough to say, oh, I have a great faith in God, I really don't have any faith in myself. Because what is the worth of this person's faith in God if this person doesn't have faith in one's own self? And therefore, the first thing we must have is have that faith in oneself. Yes, there will be difficulty, but I will do it. Even if I don't succeed, I will fail while giving my best. I won't give up and say, oh no, why try? And so Shraddha, and how does Shraddha, this deep faith, how can it be cultivated? And the Upanishads, the Gita, are unanimous in stressing that can be cultivated only through a life of discipline, or an honest, truthful life. An immoral person, an unethical person, can never have that deep faith in themselves. And that's the basic requirement for a spiritual seeker, therefore. That's cultivation. We already have the seeds of that faith, seeds of the Shraddha in our heart. But those seeds can be cultivated only through leading an honest, truthful life. And finally, making an effort to live in the presence of God. So as spiritual seekers, whatever spiritual practice we have of prayer, worship, japa, meditation, spiritual study, if we look upon all these things that we do in our lives as opportunities to be in the presence of God. Because when I'm praying, if I'm thinking of things other than God, then I'm in the presence of those other things. Because whatever I'm in presence of, those are the things I'll be thinking about. So it's not about how much time you spend praying or how much time you spend meditating. Whatever, even if it's a few minutes, but during those minutes, in whose presence am I sitting? That's why the meditation in Sanskrit is often called upasana. Upa means the asana is sitting, and upa, the prefix upa means near. So upasana literally means sitting near. So all these practices with the prayer, japa, meditation, we are sitting in the presence, sitting near God. The more we are able to do our daily practices with faith that I'm sitting in the presence of God. And if I'm sitting in God's presence, why would I want to think of anything else or anybody else? So that's the practice, living in the presence. And we have seen, all of us have experienced it, I'm absolutely sure, that those few days or those occasions when you are able to just truly immerse yourself in prayer or meditation, you feel good afterwards. You feel happy afterwards. Now, that happiness can be ours every day if we try to make it a practice which is filled with faith and with regularity and sincerity. Now, spiritual practice doesn't end when meditation ends. In fact, someone said that true religion begins when the sermon ends. And therefore, it's not just about seeing God in our heart when you're meditating, but when the meditation ends, and then when you get busy with doing the things that you need to do, when you're with your family, with your friends, or at your workplace, wherever you are, if we make an effort at such times to try to remember that just as during meditation, I made an effort to see God in my heart, at other times, these people I am with, well, they have hearts too, and God is present in their heart as well. And therefore, the more I'm able to remind myself that God is present in the heart of every person in front of me, the way of dealing with people respectfully, with true love, just as we have this feeling of reverence, of love, when we are in a shrine or in a temple. So that reverence, that love will automatically color the way we speak, the way we deal with other people, the way we relate to other people, if we try to remember that God is present in them. So we can be in the presence of God not only when we are at a place of worship, but even when we are in apparently secular places doing secular work. So and that's why I love that book, The Practice of the Presence of God, because for all its simplicity, when we actually try beginning to practice that way, we know it's tough. So if you like, in your room, behind the door of your room, you can just write in whichever way you want, that as I go out of the room, I will try to remember that every person I meet, there is God present in that person. So we need to find ways to, because it's so easy to forget these things, if we can find ways to remind ourselves, the more we try to remind ourselves, the firmer the impression will be in our heart, and the easier then it will be for us. And then once that impression becomes very strong in the mind, then we will tend to forget it very less. And so these are some of the things we can do in order to be happy in a very spiritual way. Living without expectations, living without regret, living with a positive frame of mind, and trying to live always in the presence of God. And if we are always in the presence of God, we have nothing to worry. Everything will be taken care of. Why should we have any anxiety at all? It's like this, when a little baby is in her mother's arms, a baby is not afraid of anything. A baby thinks, well, we were all babies once, and we felt, well, my mom and dad can do anything. They are the best. There's no difficulty that my mom and dad can't solve. When we grow older, we have different ideas, but but when we are little, now we can be babies like that. And we are, in fact. We say, well, God is my father, God is my mother. Then we are. If I'm truly a child of God, and if I'm truly remember that I'm in the presence of God, why should I have any worries at all? Swami Ramakrishnananda, great disciple of Ramakrishna, once said, and I think it's a profound statement that we all need to remember. He said, the presence of worry and anxiety in our mind is an indication that our faith in God hasn't become strong yet. So it's easy to say, well, I believe in God. It's easy to say I have faith in God. When that faith and that belief, that it becomes so strong, so mature, when I know God is present right by my side, 24/7, all the time, all anxiety, all worry will go, and then I'll automatically be happy. Swami Vivekananda said that throughout his years in the West, he always felt that the Divine Mother was holding him by the hand. Now, these are the great experiences these people had. And we have the capacity, the power within us to have that same experience. All of these things that I mentioned today, none of these things are impossible. If we begin to start practicing it, however imperfectly, we may not succeed doing this perfectly right away, or perhaps we can. But even if we don't, even an imperfect practice of these 4 basic principles, we will already begin to experience happiness. So here is one challenge, not challenge really. Well, think about it this way. If you make a sincere effort to live like this, without expectation, without regrets, with a positive frame of mind, and trying to remain always in the presence of God, try it for a month. And then first try now, say, well, how happy you are. And then after a month, just find out whether you feel a little bit more happy. And I can guarantee you will. So it's definitely something worth trying. And finally, this thought. If we want to make other people happy, we will have to be happy ourselves. If there is no happiness within us, I can only share what I have. If there is happiness within me, I can share that happiness. If there is love in my heart, I'll be able to share that love. If that is not there, it'll be just an empty show of happiness. You can see a forced smile and a smile that comes through an inner happiness. There is difference in it. And therefore, even if we want to make people around us happy, if we want to love other people, we must try to develop these things within our own heart first. So there is a spiritual way to do things, and there is a non-spiritual way to do it. So pursuit of happiness is the great ideal, but if we, as spiritual seekers, follow these few basic spiritual principles, we can be happy ourselves, and we can bring happiness into the hearts of people around us as well. Om Jananim Saratam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu.